Emma Keeley, member for Lowan, thanks for joining us again on Flow. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's great to speak with you, and hello to your listeners.
Now, let's talk about sport first, because there's been a lot of consternation, some late-night meetings with leagues when it comes to, and they've had to track the restrictions with the Victorian government. Can we talk about just generally the leagues in your electorate and how they've had to handle these restrictions as they roll through this week?
Yeah, there's always an enormous amount of confusion and uncertainty when there are rule changes. And for our local leagues and clubs, they were taken by surprise on Saturday when there was a sudden rule change that no spectators would be allowed at football or netball games. Of course, this is a really important part of community sport. It's not just about getting the money through the gate to ensure that these clubs are financially viable, but having spectators at the game is, an essential part of the club aesthetic. It's a community, and it's how people support one another. They support their local community, and those important mental health benefits that go with it of feeling like you're part of a team. The clubs have been just absolutely lost earlier in this week, looking at cancelling games this coming weekend because they couldn't operate. And it was a bit preposterous. In Geelong, you could have 7,000 people at the GMHBA Stadium, but next door at St Mary's, local footy ground, they weren't allowed any spectators.
Yeah.
It's just the inconsistencies that are driving people spare, and people are really frustrated about it.
And we've commented on air in our discussions between the people on the panel just about how it seems regional Victoria is often an afterthought here. We were pursuing Victoria Health about parents when it came to junior sport, and whether they were allowed, this was before the restrictions were eased, whether they were allowed to be at the ground or stay in their cars while their kid was playing sport, and they wouldn't give us a straight answer. They just kept pointing us to the previous advice, which was ambiguous about that subject. Now, it's all been eased since then, but it almost seems like it comes to inquiries from MPs and media for them to realise, we've got a problem out there.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's been very, very frustrating for everybody that the scientific data hasn't been released and won't be released that explains why there's this inconsistency, not just between different rules, but really on a week-by-week basis. It simply doesn't make any sense that you can only have 70 people at a local funeral, but the same community can have a footy game of 1,000 people, including people from out of town, on the weekend. So people are rightly asking, where is the science behind this? Why is it okay for people who are watching an AFL match to gather together in the thousands, but when we're in our local area, we can't, have more than 5 people in our own home where we know where they live and where they come from and their risk of actually having coronavirus. It just doesn't make sense.
Now, are you able to say whether you've been able to engage in any advocacy for clubs or leagues within your electorate when it came to this recent week and the restrictions that were being imposed?
Yeah, I mean, we're constantly in contact with the relevant ministers and also the Chief Health Officer's office to try and gain clarity about rules. And also trying to advocate and call for fairness and equity and a bit of common sense when it comes to recognising the benefit that things like community sport have in terms of looking after and nourishing people's mental health, the importance of hospital visits and aged care visitors, the importance of just getting together in the community, not in massive groups, and we're not asking for people to put anything at risk. If there was a case of coronavirus, absolutely, lock us down. That's what we need to happen. But when we don't have a case, let's value the mental health rewards of getting together in a safe way and promote that. But it's just really, really difficult to keep that fight up because, and I think people are becoming more and more frustrated with the government because they're simply not getting the answers and the rules are becoming less clear rather than more clear as time goes on.
So before we leave the topic of sport and look at these other impacts of restrictions, to your understanding, say the Wimmera League and the Horsham District League, those are both going ahead with their 1,000 crowd limit this weekend, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. They were very relieved, I think would be the best way to put it, to see that there had been an additional dot point included in the restrictions that were released yesterday around a venue cap of 1,000 people. And that's a common sense approach. Let's face it, at this time of the year we've had wonderful rain. It's pretty cold out there. people are either going to be sitting in their cars or they're going to be huddled around, whatever they can find that's warm. They're unlikely to be, having 300 people inside the club rooms. It's simply not going to happen. We need to make sure that people are able to go and support their local clubs. And as I said, it was a huge relief for all of our leagues to know that they could actually keep their games going, to recognise the importance of that club sport in the community and give that sense of community back and sense of belonging to people who follow the footy and netball every single weekend.
So when it comes to, now there's a border bubble between South Australia and Victoria at the moment, what's your understanding of the requirement to submit to a COVID test before going into South Australia for people in your electorate?
Yeah, there has been some easing of restrictions in terms of regional Victorians now being able to enter South Australia. However, there are heavy requirements that come with it. No one objects to a coronavirus test. We've all had them. But with the new South Australian restrictions, you have to have a COVID test on day one and then isolate until you get the results. Now, I had a COVID test a couple of weeks ago and it took 3 days to get the results. So in terms of people who are planning to go away for a weekend, maybe in Roe, Beach, Port, anywhere through the Limestone Coast or up to Renmark even, if they are choosing to do that, are they really going to want to go over the border and stay in isolation for 3 days while they wait for results? Or are they going to choose to go elsewhere and spend their holiday money perhaps elsewhere in Victoria, maybe even go through New South Wales? It's something that I'm hearing from a few locals as school holidays are coming up around the corner, and I fear that the South Australian government might be cutting off their nose to spite their face, and South Australian businesses are really going to suffer by simply not being able to have visitors from regional Victoria who haven't been anywhere near a case of coronavirus ever.
Yeah, that seems quite odd for the idea that you're on school holidays, and as a parent, as you are, the idea of, yes, you love your kids and you want to be away with them, but you want them to be able to go outside and run around and do things, but you're going to have to isolate in a holiday accommodation or at a campsite until you get your negative result on your COVID test. It's not a great sales pitch for a holiday in South Australia.
It's not. I don't know anyone who want to be holed up in a tent or a caravan or a small apartment for 3 days with your kids while they're going a little bit mad over the school holidays because they're not allowed out and about and even to the playground over the road. My family were looking at doing a trip into South Australia, a camping trip, heading up to the Birdsville track, and that's off the cards now. We won't be doing that because of the South Australian restrictions, and there are many other families that are in exactly the same boat. And look, you've got to balance that risk. Is there a risk of heading up the Birdsville track and bringing coronavirus into South Australia, or is there a greater, is the benefit, I guess, of the money that won't be spent in South Australia, is that really worth it? And that's a decision that the South Australian Premier has made, and it's up to Premier Marshall to justify the harms that are being done to those businesses and what support he's going to provide to those businesses to compensate for cutting off this important tourist trade for those local South Australian businesses.
Yeah, personally, I suspect Premier Marshall, when he's got a federal Prime Minister who's the same political colour, he's probably going to want to start lining up the Andrews government as the one to criticise going into a state election next year by being tough on Victorians. That's the approach it looks like to me.
Yeah, it's the South Australian rules, though, isn't it? I think, there's a lot of slipperiness, I think, in some politicians, and particularly we've seen it between Premier Andrews and Premier Marshall. There's a lot of chest beating and, name-calling across the border of why would you want to travel to South Australia, and then, right. Retaliated lockdowns. And look, it's people who live in the cross-border zones and the businesses that operate in those areas that are really being hit hard, and it's causing an enormous amount of mental health or mental trauma on the way through. It's not fair.
So speaking of mental health, you're the Shadow Minister for Mental Health in Victoria. The challenge you mentioned earlier about a funeral, for instance, and the contrast, 1,000 people can turn up at the footy, but roughly 70 at a funeral. Is that what you're hearing from constituents, is that frustration at the disparity now the rules have been announced yesterday?
Absolutely. We had the sad loss of Conniva's last World War II veteran this week, Jack Mills, OAM. He was well loved in the community, and obviously his contribution to the community and to Australia is well recognised, and he deserves to have a fitting send-off for someone who's done so much for the local community and beyond. He can only have 70 people at his funeral on Tuesday, but this weekend you can have 1,000 people at the local footy and netball match. It just doesn't seem like a fair recognition for some of those events where we need to be able to get together, grieve together, and also pay our respects. And if it's the same crowd that would attend on the Saturday footy game as would attend Jack's funeral, then it's really difficult for the government to justify why one is more of a risk than the other. And I really do continue to call on the Andrews Labor government to release that scientific data, because if we understood why they're making these decisions, then maybe it would calm a lot of people in the community, because the lack of certainty is really frustrating for a lot of people.
Is there an opportunity to escalate that? I know that the attempts to escalate the tragedy when it came to the Warrnambool boy who had drowned and the funeral for him, James Merlino, the acting premier, he ultimately addressed that personally, and he said it was up to the health department, but he wasn't going to intervene, and ultimately no one was allowed to attend that funeral. Can you escalate that for special consideration, that RSL veteran?
Oh, we always do. We always try our best, and it's been, I'm fortunate. It's not just Emma Keeley MP. I've got a fantastic team of people behind me, and they are constantly getting calls around the COVID restrictions, what people can and can't do, because I think for the most part, everyone wants to do the right thing, and they probably, go overboard rather than trying to cut corners when it comes to the restrictions. But more and more we're hearing critical stories where people have been cut off from their family and friends in times when they really do need them. Whether it's about, somebody who can't be with their partner, who's having a miscarriage in hospital, whether it's about events like funerals, large funerals where, when the restrictions were really low for funerals and even the immediate family weren't able to all attend. And you've got situations of, elderly people who are, say, 100 years old in an aged care facility who just want to give their family a hug. They know they're not going to be in this, on this earth for much longer.
Yeah.
They're more than happy to, take the risk of having, getting coronavirus when there hasn't been any cases of coronavirus in their local community at all. They want the choice to be able to say, you know what, I'm happy to run the risk of getting coronavirus for the sake of giving my family at least one last hug. And I think that's a humanity that's been lost in a lot of the restrictions, and it's where we continually work and lobby for fairness, and also for the government to have a heart and not be so cruel in some of their restrictions and how they're applied, and to have some common sense where, particularly in areas that are so far away from Melbourne and our nearest coronavirus cases.
Well, Emma, thanks for bringing that to our attention, and we look forward to seeing some restrictions further eased. Good news for sports followers, but probably not good news for those that want to get to a funeral and other community events, and hopefully there's a more balanced approach going forward.
Thanks so much, Ricky. We'll keep on trying to make sure it's fair, and that we're trying to do the right thing for coronavirus to stop the spread, but let's just focus the restrictions on the areas where there are actually cases to spread.